Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all here with us tonight. Can everybody hear me and see my presentation, Peter? Is that all good? Technology is working for us?
I hope so.
Well, if you can see it, others can see it.
Somebody just raised her hand. Is there some technical problem or? Okay, I think you should start.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Then I will do just that. I will just reduce the talking heads and I will proceed to my presentation. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of thinking on the origins of ancient Egyptian civilization. And I'm going to start way back. And in order to do that, I will have to use a number of concepts. Hang on, my presentation is hanging. It is not working. Yeah, it is working now. Because I would like to make you all aware that I'm going to use terms that I would normally not use, and terms that are very controversial, obviously, in today's current debates. And I would just like to advise of the Yena Declaration on Human Races of 2019 that basically holds that human races do not exist, and I subscribe to this declaration. There is no scientific basis for races and for distinction between humans by races, by appearance, by genes whatsoever. And however, I will have to employ some of the terms that are associated with racialism and racism and races. I have chosen this lovely picture by Watteau, the Battle of the Pyramids, dating to 1798-99. And I have chosen a quote that was purportedly said by Napoleon Bonaparte before the battle at the pyramids in 1798, that he was here together with his French army and masses of soldiers in order to extract this country, this region from barbarism and bring civilization to the Orient. So we have to look at the historical context, both of the image and of the quote, and of course of what Napoleon Bonaparte was doing in Egypt. We are in the age of European imperialism. The 18th and 19th century saw a rise in colonial activity by European national states that are themselves in the process of emerging. We're talking about specifically the scramble for Africa, in which numerous European countries competed for power over the Black continent. And on the right, you see a picture of the situation in 1884. So quite some time after Napoleon Bonaparte's actually failed attempt to colonize Egypt for the French. But the question, of course, is why did Napoleon Bonaparte suggest that Egypt was apparently suffering of barbarism and needed to be bestowed with civilization by the French? Well, this can be easily explained because colonialism and European imperialism had a number of ideological underpinnings. And one of that was the concept of racial and cultural superiority on the side of the colonial occupiers and racial and cultural inferiority on the side of the colonized subjects. So as a colonizer, Napoleon Bonaparte proposed to bring civilization to the inferior, racially and culturally inferior Africans or Near Easterners. This is a principle within which practically every major historical narrative, ancient and modern, was framed at that time. And we also have a number of philosophical and general thoughts that were formulated, for example, in the early 18th century that provided, if you want, a philosophical underpinning of this concept. For example, there is a French philosopher named Henri de Boulainvilliers who wrote an essay on French nobility, but also on the concept of two races being opposed each other and one superior race to be the dominant, the occupying, colonizing race. And this is practically the beginning of a concept that we can call the two-race theory. Soon after, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, worked with this concept and devised a racial hierarchy and a relation between the physical appearance and abilities or cultural development of different races. And in there, we can already find notions of white supremacy. At around the same time, Arthur de Gobineau, another French writer, French diplomat, who of course had a significant role within this whole trend of colonialism, wrote an essay on the inequality of human races in 4 volumes. So again, this is basically the philosophical underpinning for colonialism. So what has this got to do with ancient Egyptian civilization? Well, there is a lot and actually very little that this all has to do with ancient Egyptian civilization. And this is why we need to follow the progress of time with this situation as the starting point and see that just at that time, Egyptology came into being. Napoleon Bonaparte brought with him not only a whole army with thousands of soldiers, but also a team of scientists and illustrators and botanists and geologists and you name it, who, whose role it was to describe Egypt. And they produced these beautiful volumes, Description de l'Égypte, that enhanced knowledge about ancient Egypt and modern Egypt in part also. And Jean-François Champollion soon after decided to look into the script of the ancient Egyptians and indeed succeeded to decipher the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And that is for us, of course, the birth of Egyptology as an academic discipline. And at the same time, it was discovered, well, ancient Egypt was a civilization. It had a writing system. It was able to build grand, beautiful, monumental structures, the pyramids, these beautiful temples in Thebes and so forth. But how can we explain that? This was a conundrum that 19th century scholars saw themselves confronted with. How do we explain that on the Black continent of Africa, this amazing ancient civilization could actually emerge? To solve this conundrum, a number of scholars started to explain the origins of Egyptian civilization with external factors. And there was a very strong trend in anthropology, which was working very often in the service of the colonial powers to describe the colonized subjects, to typologize the different races. And it was these anthropologists who produced what they understood or what they suggested to be the scientific foundation for racial hierarchy and the two-race concept, and also the origins of Egyptian civilization. One of the earliest scholars was Franz Ignaz Brunner Bey, who was himself a German physician, anatomist, and anthropologist, who traveled with expeditions to Egypt. And he was probably one of the first, if not the first, scientist to analyze ancient Egyptian skeletal remains. For him, racial typology was part of his toolbox, and he divided what he saw, what he had examined, into two races, a finer race and a coarser type. And this finer type, he said, was of Caucasian origin, was not white. And these Caucasians were the founders of Pharaonic civilization. So this is very, very interesting, but Brunner Bey was not the only one. There was a whole group of anthropologists and ethnologists who arrived at very similar results. And I'm listing here a number of scholars in chronological sequence, starting with Morton, Hartmann, Oettiking, Starr, Smith, von Luschan, Müller, Derry, and Derry pursued just these ideas until as late as 1956. We will come back to this historical context in a moment. So you see that Brunner Bey was not the only one. He was only starting this trend of looking at the races of the ancient Egyptians and deciding that civilization had external origins. In general, at that time, it was an almost accepted consensus with very few deviating opinions that Egyptian civilization was founded by a Caucasian race, or as Breasted called it in 1915, the Great White Race that had invaded Africa and dominated the local African populations. Now, if we look at the historical and cultural context of this time, we see that Egyptology was obviously founded in the middle of this colonial era during the scramble for Africa. And then as we move a little bit further on in time into the early 20th century, we see how the European imperial powers competed with each other over Africa, but also over areas in Europe, and battled each other and struggled for dominance of the European continent. And the result were obviously two terrible world wars, where all these unresolved questions were tried to be resolved by force. In this context, we also have the emergence of fascism and of anti-Semitism. And embedded in these ideological political trends, some of the conclusions that anthropologists and anatomists arrived at looking at skeletal remains from ancient Egypt can be embedded in this very climate. And I brought you a quote from Friedrich Wilhelm Müller of 1915, where he studies the skeletal remains of the pre-dynastic cemetery at Abu Sir el-Melek, and produced the anthropological results of his studies. And he came to the conclusion that there are several racial groups, racial types present in the cemetery. And in particular, what he thought was very interesting and very significant for the question was that there were actually Aryans living at Abu Sir el-Melek. And that is just one example of that political and ideological climate of the time that also influenced Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology. I have collated a number of trends on this graph here, where you can see at the top, the blue and the right and the red arrows, they represent the cultural and the historical context of the time. And then you have in green a number of concepts that started to trend in the 19th century and that found an application in Egyptian archaeology. These are, for example, the so-called Hamitic migration theory, migrationism in archaeology, the ethnic interpretation of culture, a racial or biological distinction of cultures, and a historical retrospective approach. And I would like to focus now on the concepts of the so-called Hamitic migration theory and migrationism as concepts that were really intensively utilized in early Egyptian archaeology to legitimize ideas about the external origins of ancient Egyptian civilization. The Hamitic migration theory had rather innocuous beginnings following a biblical tradition that gives us the narrative of the deluge and the family of Noah, his sons, Sem, Ham, and Japhet, who survived the deluge, and their progeny started to spread from the point of arrival of Noah's Ark into the rest of the world. His son Sem remained in Asia, Japhet went on to Europe, and Ham went on to Africa to populate Africa. Before the European Enlightenment and humanism, as I just gave you an example in the form of Immanuel Kant, Hamites were considered a people or a race, as they were considered the original inhabitants of North Africa. And this is why traditionally we used to speak of the Hamitic language families. In the 19th century, in this whole historical context that I just described for you, Hamites were constructed to be Caucasians who had invaded Africa. They were seen as a superior race that dominated the original Black African races. And the Hamites were the ones who brought Pharaonic civilization to Africa. This is very well reflected in a number of writings of early archaeologists who worked with early Egypt. And one of the earliest was clearly Jacques de Morgo, who published in 1897 his research on the origins of Egypt. And he came to the conclusion that there was indeed a prehistoric civilization, which is represented by the indigenous pre-Egyptian inhabitants of the Nile Valley. And later came a conquest of Egypt by an external civilization. And he, de Morgan, suggested that this external civilization was a different race, very civilized people. They represented a physiognomy of great quality, d'une grande finesse. And for him, these were the Egyptians. Their origins, he suggested, were in Western Asia, in Chaldea, for example. So with de Morgan, we see the beginning of this kind of early archaeology, trying to find archaeological evidence for an external origin of Egyptian civilization. Of course, one of the key proponents in this, and a competitor to Morgan, if you want, was Flinders Petri. Flinders Petri has worked on this topic intensively. And he arrived at the conclusion in two of his key works of 1920 and 1939 that basically all prehistoric Egyptian cultures had an external origin. For example, the early Fayum and Neolithic and Badarian cultures. They were the result of a Solutrean migration from the Caucasus and Black Sea. The Amratian first civilization was the result of Libyan invasions. The Jazean, or the second civilization, as he called it, was brought to Egypt by invaders, by an eastern desert folk or people from Syria. He wasn't quite decided on the precise point of origin, but clearly external to Northeast Africa. The Sumerian, or third civilization, that was, of course, his piece de résistance, the dynastic race conquest, which certainly originated in Elam, that is in modern day Iran. And finally, to top this off, there were also Nubian invaders who came from the south and who swept down and broke the second civilization. Petri was very clear on this. And he gives us a lot of descriptions of how he envisaged how this was all happening. He spoke of invasions in very, very clear terms. The invasion by the Elamite race that began the dynastic series. And he speaks of a tumultuous age of dynastic invasion here in his chapter 8 of Prehistoric Egypt, which is titled The Dynastic Conquest, Conflict of Races. He speaks about a tumultuous age of dynastic invasion, and he suggests that this invasion was one of the greatest events in the history of Egypt. To illustrate that and to document or to substantiate these claims, he used a number of artifacts that were known at this time already, such as the Gebel el-Arak knife handle, where we see battle and where we see iconographic elements that do not seem to have an origin in North Africa, but rather in the art of the Near East. This was basically the essence why he arrived at this conclusion of the dynastic race conquest. There is an interesting variant to this topic, which is best represented by Herman Juncker, because Herman Juncker found a combination of these two different origins of Egyptian civilization. On the one hand, he said there were the Hamites, the indigenous inhabitants of Africa, and on the other hand, there were also Aryans. Herman Juncker was professor of Egyptology here in Vienna, and he made it his particular responsibility to investigate what he called the Hamitic question, and he wanted to investigate Hamitic Africa. In 1923, he therefore founded the Institute for Egyptology and African Studies at the University of Vienna. Together with colleagues of his era, he constructed a linguistic group that he named Hamitic, which was supported by racial and anthropology typology, describing a type of tall, gracile, and light-skinned human race. Juncker suggested that the Hamites, they were located in Africa, but they were not African, at least not what Juncker understood to be African. He spoke of light-skinned Hamites, in other words, white Hamites. As we all know, Herman Juncker excavated in the Neolithic village of Merim de Beni Salama, together with his colleagues Oswald Mengin, himself an Austrian prehistorian, and Douglas Derry, an anthropologist. And the three of them decided that the inhabitants of Merimde were of a Nordic, of the Aryan race, who had entered Egypt via Europe and Western Africa, specifically Libya. So here you have a reconstruction of how Juncker must have seen these different streams from Asia to Africa. These are the Hamites who had migrated into Africa at a very early stage. Juncker himself was an ordained priest, so he obviously followed very closely biblical traditions, but at the same time, he was also an anti-Semite. And for him, it was important to emphasize that Egyptian civilization was not of Semitic origin. This could not be, and hence he followed those trends that suggested that the Aryans departed from Scandinavia, traveled, migrated south via Western Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, then across via Gibraltar to North Africa, and via Libya, then into Egypt. And these Aryans, this northern type, or as he called it also, the Giza type, because he thought he had the same peoples, the same race in the Giza cemeteries. They were the founders of Pharaonic civilization, and they were opposed with an Upper Egyptian, light-skinned, gracile Hamite people. So already in Juncker's early work, we have this opposition of Lower Egyptian and Upper Egyptian races, as he called it, or types. And he then suggested in a famous lecture that he gave in 1920 that the Negroes, we don't use this word today, obviously, anymore. I use it only for historical reasons, entered Egyptian history only from the New Kingdom onward. So he made it very clear that Black Africans had nothing to do with this. This is obviously a very extreme variant, however, represented by one of the most influential Egyptologists and archaeologists of his time. Now, here we are again at this graph, and you can now see how the Hamitic migration has been very influential in this narrative, that migrationism in archaeology has played a very important role, and that the racial biological distinction of culture and the ethnic interpretation of culture were behind all these concepts. There is also a very strong European prehistoric basis or foundation that provided further substantiation for these ideas, and they are represented by Gustav Kusina, a German prehistorian and philologist, as well as by Vere Gordon Child, a British archaeologist who defined what cultures were. Cultures represented people, and cultures could be used as actors to narrate important historical events. And basically, with these two very influential prehistorians, we have the definition of the ethnic distinction of archaeological cultures, migrationism, and what is today understood as a culture historical archaeology. Petri's sequence of pre-dynastic cultures is a perfect example for this culture historical archaeology, with his different what he called first civilization, second civilization, third civilization, and each one of them being caused by an invasion from outside. So why did Petri believe, for example, that the Judæan civilization had its origins in the Eastern Desert or Syria? Well, he substantiated that, for example, with the raw materials of certain artifacts that were particularly typical for the Judæan, for the second civilization, like these stone vessels here, which obviously come from the Eastern Desert. He also suggested that with parallels of certain artifacts in Levantine archaeology of the time, such as the wavy handled pottery. And what we have here in front of us is obviously this equation, pots equal people. So when you have new types of artifacts appearing in an archaeological context, this automatically means that we have the traces of migration, because these objects were brought by migrating people to their new destination. Now we move on in time and look at the post-war era. Obviously, the Second World War which was most cataclysmic and disastrous for all of Europe and for all of the world. But with it, of course, came a very important development. The United Nations were founded, and in 1948, the UN Charter of Human Rights was set in stone, basically, and with it came the equality of all human beings in the world, and basically, and in principle, the end of racism and of racial typology and racial hierarchy. In this post-World War era, we can observe a number of significant changes in the archaeological paradigms used to explain the origins of Egyptian civilization. And one of the key proponents here is, of course, Werner Kaiser. Werner Kaiser tried to explain the emergence of Egyptian civilization in different ways. He saw internal African components, but he also saw external components, especially in his early works. We have to really, Kaiser had a publication history spanning 40 years, and you cannot compare the early and the late phase and say this is all the same. You really have to make a distinction between his early works, and this is represented in a number of studies, above all his own PhD thesis of 1955, and a number of publications that extracted sections of his PhD thesis. And he proposed that, for example, the Neolithic cultures, Fayum and Merimda Neolithic, had African origins, but non-African components. For example, the El Omari and Mahdi cultures were the result of Near Eastern immigrants. The Thasian culture also had African and non-African components, and it migrated from Lower Egypt to Middle Egypt. The Badarian culture was the result of migration from the Saharan Sudanese areas in the southeastern desert of Egypt into the Nile Valley. And then, of course, very important, Werner Kaiser departed from Petri's terminology, and he suggested that basically in the pre-dynastic era, we have one culture, and that is the Nagada culture. This he did on the basis of the work of his teacher, Alexander Scharf. And he then suggested that the Nagada I culture had also local African components, was later replaced by the Badarian culture, and then continued an expansion north and also south. And that was essentially repeated by the Nagada culture, the Nagada II culture, that at this time in his early work clearly had a Near Eastern origin and arrived in Upper Egypt and then proceeded in a migratory stream north and caused what his teacher, Alexander Scharf, had defined as the cultural unification, or what was also called by Kaiser the first unification of Egypt, and thereby the foundation for Egyptian civilization. So here, what we have here in this graph is now a comparison between Kaiser and Petri. You can see how much Kaiser owed to Petri's work, but he tried to modify Petri's views, which were at this time already considered absolutely extreme and not viable. So Kaiser worked with this concept and modified it to fit the then, at this time, current thinking. You can see that the two cultures here, Nagada I, Nagada II, they were related to one another, but Nagada II was still something new, a new element to the Nile Valley. And it itself arrived in the Nile Valley and then migrated or conquered the north subsequently, and thereby laid the foundation for Nagada III. In his later works, he modified this again, and I go through this really quickly. You can, most of you know these views represented in Kaiser's latest work, that Nagada I, again, was a local culture. It was located in the south, and opposite it in the north was the Mahdi or Bhutto Mahdi culture, which was considered an independent Lower Egyptian culture, and it ended with the expansion of Nagara II. And with Nagara II, there was still the question mark of a possible foreign Near Eastern component in this culture, but importantly, it migrated then from south to north, cultural unification, and Nagara III was then finally the new great political expansion across the Nile Valley, and Kaiser describes a new level of cultural development, of economic and administrative organization. And this, for him, was the beginning of Egyptian civilization. And this was cultural unity driven by Upper Egyptians, which ultimately brought Pharaonic high culture. The term high culture was very popular at this time. Also, it was synonymous basically with civilization, with something that did not apply for all archaeological cultures known in the world, but only to a small select handful of ancient cultures. And here we have Kaiser's later work, and you can see how this whole external element is gradually disappearing from his reconstructions of Egyptian pre-dynastic history. However, Kaiser still pursued certain elements of his forebears. He still employed a biological and racial distinction of the two cultures. When he spoke of the gracile Upper Egyptian type, the Nagardans, vis-a-vis the robust Lower Egyptians, the Mahdians. And this is really interesting. He suggested this racial distinction as late as 1990. And I believe in there is a problem that in the 21st century, we should no longer use because of how we see racialism and racism today. This is a big problem. However, Kaiser described in 1990 the migration of the Nagardans resulting in a mix of populations, and he also described the conquest of the north by Upper Egyptian kingdoms. And he used, for example, objects like the Nama palette and other objects of the early dynastic era of the time of Narmer and his forerunners and successors to reflect pre-dynastic events. And he suggested that the pre-dynastic conquest of Lower Egypt by Upper Egyptian kings was the first unification of Egypt. And this is the retrospective historical approach that Gustav Cousinat, whom I mentioned earlier, had suggested was the way of operating best in order to trace back the origins of a population within a certain area. So what was the evidence cited for this pre-dynastic Nagara conquest of Lower Egypt? For example, just like Petri, Kaiser used the idea of the wavy handle pottery, for example, as one key identifier of Upper Egyptian culture. In the north, on the right-hand side, you have a grave from Minshat Abu Omar number 105, where you can see wavy handle pottery and other artifacts of Upper Egyptian style, which for Kaiser was the evidence to suggest that the Nagardans had actually entered the Nile Delta and conquered it for Upper Egypt in order to include the Nile Delta in the Upper Egyptian kingdom. Again, this is the pots equals people. Many of these concepts have now been left behind. However, the I hope you can still hear me. My internet connection is currently not very stable. I hope I'm still with you. There are two aspects which are still around in 21st century archaeological reasoning. And this is migrationism and archaeology and the ethnic interpretation of culture. And for this, I only brought you two quotes. 2016, the Nagadians came to the Delta as tradesmen or settlers, but with the permission of the Lower Egyptians. Here we have narratives where the Lower Egyptians and the Upper Egyptians interact with each other in pre-dynastic times. Or we have the expression that the Mahdi culture was not interested in certain aspects in Lower Egypt, or had, or that the Nagada culture had ambitions. So we can see what Gordon Child described as the as cultures as actors in historical narratives. This is very clearly visible in the writings of a number of 21st century archaeologists. It is also still present in modern studies on ancient Egyptian civilization. As examples, I brought you Barry Kemp, Anatomy of a Civilization, or Ancient Egypt Foundations of a Civilization by Douglas Brewer, where you still have the same narratives being repeated, but certainly disconnected from the ideological ballasts. However, today, we should completely depart from these narratives as I've just described them to you. In modern archaeology, archaeological cultures are not homogeneous, normative, static, or hermetic units. There is no ethnic component. Culture is a very dynamic system that can change on its own. It does not require external stimulus, external influence. It can change as a result of internal differentiation through knowledge transfer with neighboring archaeological cultures, technology transfer, trade, exchange, mobility, migration. Yes, migration is also still on the list, but if you want to propose that migration was part of a cultural process, you need to look at the different push and pull factors. Today, we have migration on the news media headlines almost every day, and we know very well what migrations look like. We know what different types of migrations they are. We know what made people decide to leave their home countries and what pulled people to a new region. This all needs to be added to the calculation if you want to demonstrate that cultural change had occurred as a result of migration. So what are the possible origins from a modern perspective? And I will spend the last 2 minutes with what I think are possible scenarios. First of all, we need to consider what is civilization. In the old paradigm, civilization was a very broad descriptor for human societies. For example, Baumgartel spoke of the Mesolithic civilization, but it was also used in an equivalent to high culture for societies with a writing system. This is, for example, expressed in Kaiser's work. In modern day, we use civilization in two different ways that are not entirely to be separated. Civilization as a process, as an ideal or a set of norms by which societies aim to achieve civilized behavior and civility as opposed to barbarism, or civilization as a complex at the most basic level, which applies to a societal entity within a defined territory. And this last definition is very useful in archaeology. Bruce Trigger, in his wonderful opus, Understanding Early Civilizations, defined it even further: the earliest and simplest form of societies in which the basic principle governing social relations was not kingship, but a hierarchy of social divisions that cut horizontally across societies and were unequal in power, wealth, and social prestige. So complex societies would today be, in modern archaeology, the equivalent to civilizations. And Yoffe, who himself looked at early Mesopotamian civilization, suggested that it is possible for there to be several states within the same civilizational umbrella, which share the same ideological framework. So this is very useful to understand how ancient Egyptian civilization could have emerged. We are looking at a long cultural process starting very early in the 7th, 6th, 5th millennia BCE with the increasing aridization of Northeast Africa at the end of the Green Sahara phase. We see a contraction of human groups in the Nile Valley where they have more dependable ecological conditions. We see a lot of mobility and unorganized migration. And what I understand of this here is if we just look at one little section of this green arrow at the top there, we see small groups doing their rounds, as Heike Riemer once expressed it. They are not settled human groups. They are living a nomadic lifestyle, if you want, and they move around with the seasons. They meet other groups. They have interaction. They go back and forth. And this is how we have to visualize these unorganized migrations of small groups, and also a high degree of mobility, which brings us knowledge transfer, trade, and exchange. In the 5th millennium, we see the emergence of permanent agricultural villages, regionalism, of course. I don't think the term Nagada culture is really working for us anymore because we have so many regional variants, even in Upper Egypt during Nagada 1, Nagada 2, and still Nagada 3, and this continues this way. So this 5th millennium picture of emergent permanent agricultural villages brings us to the 4th millennium with permanent settlements. Of course, we have also permanent settlements already in the 5th millennium, but we see more and more of these. We see increasing social complexity, increasing craft specialization, centralization, trade, exchange, knowledge transfer. And from there, we move on, we get via the mid 4th millennium to the late 4th millennium to a situation where we actually have the first phase of ancient Egyptian state formation, which happened at a regional level. And this is witnessed by all these many different proto-dynastic royal names in different regions of Egypt that cannot all be put into one and the same sequence and narrative. They are parallel, small polities, they are complex societies in small territories, they have a writing system, they engage in peer polity competition, they have comparable ideologies expressed, for example, in the Horus name, and they have a comparable definition of institutionalized power and leadership. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is the beginning of ancient Egyptian civilization. It has its roots in northeastern Africa, in Egypt, and it did not require any external invasion, conquest, influence whatsoever. The Egyptians were perfectly capable to do this all by themselves and be the first in world global history to form the first territorial state of Egypt in phase 2 of state formation. And with this, I thank you for your attention.